week that elderly soldiers who served in Northern Ireland with the British Army may be called to give evidence on fresh inquests into deaths during the Troubles, a period of violence from the late 1960s to the late 1990s. Families of some of those who died will welcome a further investigation, but the former head of the British Army, General Lord Dannatt, says it's outrageous to expect soldiers, some now in their 70s and 80s, to recall events from so far back. Is it wrong to pursue soldiers over actions in Northern Ireland? Well, joining me now to discuss that are Dawn Foster, a journalist and broadcaster, Mark Thompson from the campaign group Relatives for Justice, Alan Barry, a former soldier from Justice for Northern Ireland Veterans, and Ruth Dudley-Edwards, a writer and historian. Mark, many veterans feel that this is a witch hunt. Can you understand how they feel?
Well, I think there's an emotive at play here, and I think there's not a witch hunt. The figures are borne out that there are only 3 soldiers subject to potential charges being taken forward in respect to almost 400 people killed by so-called security forces. If you're sitting at home in the north of Ireland today and your child was killed and there was impunity, and we're dealing with a legacy of impunity and no one was ever held to account, there was never any effective investigation, well, now's the time that we address that. And there's a mechanism to address that both governments and all the political parties have agreed to. Unfortunately, there's a dual process. There's a campaign by soldiers that don't want to answer questions, and there's a campaign by the UK government to insert now, after agreeing, a national security veto and to provide a smothering blanket to stop the truth being told. This is about accountability. Either you believe in the rule of law, you believe in justice, and you believe it, and you apply it evenly and rigorously, which has never happened.
Alan, a smothering blanket, they're covering up something here. They don't want to talk about this.
That's total rubbish. I mean, the soldiers were interviewed at the time of the incidents. This case here that I have here is a case relating to a 74-year-old veteran who was involved in an incident in the 1970s. He was questioned at the time of the incident, as were all other people on that patrol. He was re-questioned again about 20 years after the incident. And then yet again, he was arrested about 3 years ago, questioned again. And on this occasion, he was held in detention for 3 days and questioned 26 times.
Okay.
Harold Shipman was only questioned 10 times.
Okay, we don't want to get into individual cases, but that idea that, veterans are being hounded. These are people who have already given evidence.
Sure. It's an affront. Many of these soldiers who pulled triggers and killed people were questioned not as suspects but as witnesses, questioned from 1970 to 1973 by their own colleagues. The European Court of Human Rights, and cases have been taken, have found the UK government in violation of its investigative duties in respect to the north of Ireland, in which the investigations have been partial, perfunctory, and have not delivered accountability. And that is a fact, and it's ongoing now at this minute with the Committee of Ministers and the UK government. They're again before the Committee of Ministers in the 19th and 20th of September because they've continually failed. They didn't do it when it came to Republicans. 25,000 Republicans spent over 100,000 years in jail. A handful of British soldiers were convicted of killings, released early, reinstated back to their regiment, some promoted and given their back pay. The indicative message is not good, and this needs to be addressed in an even-handed way.
Okay, let's talk to someone who is in charge of those, or was in charge of those soldiers. We heard from Lord Dannatt earlier. He said it was outrageous. Emma, you're with him now.
Yes, I am joined by the former head of the British Army, General Lord Dannatt. Good morning.
Emma, good morning.
You have said it's outrageous, just to use that word, that people are being investigated again over this. Why is it outrageous?
Well, I think over the years we've had enough of what effectively is a witch hunt. Just reflect on the large number of allegations made against British soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, the vast majority of which turned out to be vexatious and fallacious. And now we're going back to Northern Ireland. I was a platoon commander aged 20, 46 years ago, and we were involved in a number of incidents in a very intense set of circumstances, but everything was investigated properly according to the rules and legislation at the time. People probably aren't aware, a soldier on patrol with his rifle had 20 rounds of ammunition. You had to account for every one of those rounds of ammunition.
So, Lord Dannatt, if I could just butt in at that point, are you saying that all of these cases categorically have been investigated as thoroughly as they should be?
They were investigated thoroughly at the time. When anybody fired a single round, that round had to be accounted for. The Royal Military Police and the Royal Ulster Constabulary took statements. The thing was investigated properly at the time.
Are you proud then of the way the British Army acted in Northern Ireland?
I'm proud of the way the British Army has acted in all the campaigns that we have been involved in and I've been involved in over an extraordinary period of time.
So, if everything was accounted for, Lord Dannett, why is the Ministry of Defence, why are the authorities agreeing to the reopening of some of these cases?
The Ministry of Defence is agreeing, as in fact it did over the Iraq and Afghanistan allegations, because it is fearful of the European Court of Human Rights and fearful of Britain coming under pressure from European legislation. That's understandable, but the point that I'm trying to make is that these things, many of these incidents took place many years ago. They were investigated properly and thoroughly at the time, and it is thoroughly unreasonable, outrageous is an expression I've used before, to expect soldiers now in their 70s and early 80s to have any kind of recall of what happened at the time.
But some people would say there should be no time limit on justice.
I think there's a practical aspect to this as well. I think a statute of limitations is a well-known concept. I think something like 30 years is probably a reasonable length of time. And the point I'm trying to make is that it was not a lawless, everything was up for grabs at the time. Matters were properly investigated. I, for example, gave evidence in several trials. I gave evidence in various coroners' courts. Things were investigated properly according to the procedures at the time. It's thoroughly unreasonable, 30, 40, 50 years later, to start to apply different principles, different procedures in very now historic cases.
Lord Dannett, thank you very much. Thoroughly unreasonable to be going back to this period of time.
Yeah, Dawn, everything was investigated at the time, according to Lord Dannett. This is thoroughly unreasonable. He calls it a witch hunt. Is that how you see it?
Not remotely. I mean, as has previously been said, it's a very, very small number of people. I don't think it was investigated properly at the time. It was investigated by the British state themselves, and we need to actually have people look at it objectively. I think the problem is that, if we argue that we should have a statute of limitations, 30 years is okay, then we need to look at how, how the problems in the north are, a completely different terrain. We're only now, getting on maybe 20 years since the peace process kind of properly began. And I think that we need to, if soldiers believe they acted appropriately, they shouldn't worry, and they should actually want to give families the answers that they want. How can families move on?
They've given the answers. They've given the answers.
They haven't. No, a huge number of families do not know exactly what happened when their relatives and their children died. They want answers. They want to be able to grieve and move on. And they can't do that without proper investigation, without soldiers being questioned as suspects and not just witnesses.
When's it going to end? We had an investigation at the time. I mean, we just keep investigating until they die?
Can I raise a point? Lord Dannett was on, he talked about soldiers accounting for the armoury that was taken out. A former British soldier, using the pseudonym of Nicky Curtis, wrote a book, Faith and Duty. In that book, he said about the rules of engagement, put them in the bin, we use the Curtis rules, and we go out and we shoot first and we ask questions later. That man killed John Copeland in Ardoyne, a father of 2 baby infants. His family want the truth now, but the point being, Sean, that ammunition wasn't accounted for, but better than that, the whole issue and the legacy of impunity has to be addressed as part of the transitional process.
We don't have time to go into individual cases. Let me bring Ruth in here. But can you understand the relatives of those victims? They want justice. There's no time limit. They need to answer questions, these veterans.
I have the deepest sympathy with the relatives of people killed during the Troubles. And I've been involved with, for instance, the civil case against the Omagh bombers. I've been involved with a lot of these people. And I have sympathy with people on all sides about this. But let's be clear. At the beginning of the peace process, Sinn Féin used to say, we don't want a hierarchy of victims. In other words, the bomber who went out to kill, who was killed by his own bomb, is on a par with the victim that he killed at the same time. They've actually now reached a stage when there is a hierarchy of victims. And for some reason or other, Republican victims matter, and the same is not true of state forces. So we now have, because hold on, Mark.
Let's let Ruth finish the case.
Mark. The case is, you have, we wouldn't say 2 lots of perpetrators. You are a soldier. There will be papers on you. There will be colleagues that you had at the time, some of whom may give evidence against you. You are a paramilitary. There is no records anywhere, absolutely none. And a code of omerta operates, so nobody's going to give evidence against you because they've already been killed. And it puts the troops in a completely impossible position.
There are records with what the troops did. There are no records for what the Republicans
Well, that's plainly not the truth, and any observer would know that the RUC, just prior to the peace agreement in 1998, destroyed tens of thousands of records it held of its own agents involved in loyalist paramilitarism, of its own agents even within the IRA, they destroyed them, and it's a record in the courts. We're going to take a challenge where they said they destroyed them because they were stored in a building that was contaminated by asbestos, but didn't provide a health and safety certificate.
Okay, there's a lot of accusations being made here, and they're all, as far as I'm concerned, it's all part of a propaganda campaign. At the end of the day, you have to deal in facts, and the facts are this. Under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, and this is where this all started, the Blair government sold out the British Army, both here on the mainland and our colleagues in Northern Ireland. It was a treacherous agreement where effectively no one knew what the agreement were, the full details of it, and behind closed doors, effectively, we were left open for prosecution. Now, if you release over 300 prisoners who have been convicted of terrorist crimes and murders, and then issue over 150 OTRs on the run letters to people who hadn't even been apprehended, and then you have Jerry Adams, can I just finish? You have Jerry Adams 2 days ago saying it would be counterproductive to jail the IRA killers of Tom Oliver, a farmer, who was shot in the back of the head for being accused of being a Garda informer. I mean, come on, guys, let's get real here.
And that's what many people are saying. Are we chasing both sides equally? There are Republicans who've done a lot of bad things who are walking free, and they are pursuing British soldiers.
As I said earlier, due process was applied during the conflict against Republicans, and 25,000 of them went to jail. No soldiers did. There's a legacy, there's a deficit of accountability and justice. But I just want to come to the point that if we follow this logic very quickly, then we're saying that those that have culpability and questions the answer for Grenfell or Hillsborough shouldn't be chased and asked questions.